information age that we live in, what do you do when you have a question? You Google it, right? It's such a common thing that to Google is now a verb in our vocabulary. Making it into the top 10 most asked questions on Google are how to tie a tie, how many ounces are in a cup, and I kid you not, when is Mother's Day? One of my favorite features on Google is called Street View, which allows you to look up an address, but instead of just giving you directions, Street View literally gives you the view from the street level. Of course, Google allows you to find out the answers to all kinds of questions. Well, a couple of disciples from our gospel lesson today sound like they would have liked to ask Google a few questions. Thomas and Philip both want answers. Thomas wants to know where Jesus is going and how to follow him, and he's not being metaphorical here. He literally wants Jesus to draw him a map or give step-by-step instructions on where to go. And Philip says, Lord, just show us the Father and we will be satisfied. In other words, Lord, give us concrete directions and a preview of what our destination will look like. And don't skimp on the details, right? Now, these things that they are asking about, they make me think of Google Street View, directions to where you're going and pictures of what's there. Well, this passage is about looking ahead to the future. Just for some perspective, even though we're reading this gospel lesson today on the 5th Sunday of the season of Easter, in terms of the narrative of John's gospel, this passage is from earlier in the book, before Jesus' death and resurrection. Scholars refer to this section of John's gospel and the chapters surrounding it as the farewell discourse, because this is Jesus' final time to be a teacher to his disciples before his death. This conversation in the passage takes place on the night of the Last Supper, the same night that Jesus washes his disciples' feet. But even though events are about to happen quickly, John takes his time to narrate Jesus' final conversation with his disciples before his arrest later that evening. John dedicates 5 whole chapters to this last evening, and just to highlight how important this farewell discourse is, John only needed 12 chapters to narrate 3 years of Jesus' ministry prior. So these teachings are important. There's a lot going on here. When reading about the week of Jesus' Passion, or Holy Week as we often call it, I usually want to imagine that by the night of the Last Supper, Jesus' disciples got it. Something clicked with them. But nope, not even close. Later on, they will go to the garden with questions aplenty, still on their heart and mind. Well, on that fateful night, after years together, his disciples still have trouble understanding what Jesus is teaching. It sounds like Thomas wants Jesus to pull out the map and point to where he's going so that Thomas can know the way too. And I get the sense that Philip is looking for some kind of assurance from Jesus about who he really is. Even though they have both witnessed Jesus' powerful, miraculous deeds and heard his teachings firsthand, Thomas and Philip want more answers. Philip says to Jesus, Lord, show us the Father and we will be satisfied. Now that's not the only translation of this passage. It could also be read, Lord, show us the Father and it is sufficient for us, or even it is enough for us. But is it really? Philip has been with Jesus, God incarnate, and it hasn't been enough. From this brief conversation here between Thomas, Philip, and Jesus, I can't tell if these disciples are skeptical or clueless or if they're challenging Jesus. Maybe a little bit of all of those things. Whatever their motivation, Thomas and Philip are looking for answers that cannot be found in a map or in a picture or by just Googling it. Thomas and Philip are looking for answers that can only be found in a relationship with Jesus the Christ. Since this gospel passage takes place in the hours before Jesus' arrest, this is his final chance to really drive home what a life lived in relationship with God looks like. He has a final chance to prepare his disciples for what life will be like once he himself is crucified. Now, we often read the beginning of this gospel lesson at funerals, and I don't know about you, but when I hear that in my Father's house there are many dwelling places, my mind wants to envision God's residence as an opulent mansion in the sky. Actually, the King James translation says, in my Father's house there are many mansions. So maybe heaven is a neighborhood of mansions, and we each get one. But if we look at the original Greek, the word used there for house is oikos, which refers to, yes, a physical dwelling, but also a household of family members. And the dwelling place to which Jesus refers carries both a physical meaning and the meaning of abiding with. So we could say that Jesus is telling his disciples that there is a place for them in God's family, a place where they will abide with the presence of God for eternity. The good news today is that there is a place for you in God's family, a place where you will abide in the presence of God for eternity. Now that should have been enough for the disciples, right? But of course, Thomas is trying to plan their route, and Philip wants to know what the destination looks like. Philip even says that if he could just see the Father, that would be enough. He could then be satisfied. But I wonder why at this point in the story is Philip unsatisfied? He's seen Jesus' miraculous deeds firsthand, seen the crowds that have followed him in awe. So why is Philip still not satisfied? I wonder, is he worried that Jesus isn't quite as powerful as he said? You know, and just before this section in chapter 13, Jesus tells his disciples that he knows he will be betrayed. Is Philip afraid that if things get ugly with the Jewish leaders or Roman authorities, that Jesus will just be another poor Jewish man with little influence? I don't know. But as we live through another week of dealing with the virus, COVID-19, I feel a little bit like Philip. I have known the power of God at work in my life. I have seen the goodness of the Lord around me, but I am still not satisfied. Now, I'm projecting my own perspective on the story now, but I feel like Philip wants some assurance that somehow, some way, in the end, he will see God and everything will be all right. That's how I've felt recently. I want some assurance that somehow, some way, everything will be all right. I don't know how many times in recent weeks I've said, if we could just know when this virus stuff would end, or if I could just know that my loved ones would stay healthy, if I could just know the end and how to get there, then I could breathe a sigh of relief now. But that's not quite how life works, is it? There's no crystal ball into the future. And if you Google, what does the future look like, as I did, you get images of sleek buildings and high-tech gadgets, which is interesting, but not necessarily helpful for the issue at hand. It would be more helpful to turn to the Scriptures and to read about people like Stephen, who with his dying breath proclaimed with confidence where he was going, into God's hands. Or to turn to the scriptures and hear that we are God's people. Or to reread the gospel lesson for today and hear the good news that Jesus has gone to the grave ahead of us and has already prepared a place for us. Jesus is trying to teach us what the end of this life looks like. It looks like a chance to sit in the presence of God forever. For some of us, that knowledge may be enough, but for many of us, we would sure like to know a few more details. It's tempting. I know it's tempting, but I've had to remind myself recently not to get so caught up in trying to predict the future that I miss the relationship offered in the present. Through the life of God incarnate, through Jesus' teachings and miraculous deeds, through Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, the God of creation invites us, invites you into a life-changing, life-giving relationship. The future is covered. Jesus has gone ahead of us. Jesus has prepared a place for us. And in the meantime, there will be trials and temptations, along with triumphs and joys. But as members of God's family, we are invited into a life-changing, life-giving relationship with Jesus. Whether we live or we die, we belong to the Lord. And those are the words that I cling to in times of uncertainty. It is the relationship with Jesus that I rely on to get me through any time. And I pray that you too will now rely on that relationship that Jesus has offered you to celebrate the joys and to walk alongside us through all of life's challenges. Amen.